Well, I guess you got your fill of what Neanderthals were like. And just a reminder of what the anatomy looked like for these Neanderthal skulls. Very, very distinctive. I'm often asked, have we ever met aliens? And this is the alien we met. When we came into Europe, out of Africa, we did that several different times. There were several different out of Africas, as you may remember. But when we, Homo sapiens, as we are today, came out of Africa 50, 60,000 years ago or so, and entered Europe by 40, 45,000 years ago, we met Neanderthals. They were an alien form, and we were an alien form to them. So you can imagine Neanderthals living there for a very long period of time, looking out on the landscape and seeing another upright walking bipedal creature, very, very heavily, probably very heavily decorated, carrying weapons they didn't recognize, like spear throwers and perhaps the bow and arrow, and they must have been terribly alarmed. And I can only imagine the first encounter when one of these Homo sapiens coming out of Africa, they were probably taller and slimmer, they were probably fairly darkly pigmented, much darker skin than Neanderthals that had very light skin. So they were the others. They were different. They were aliens to Neanderthals. And I can imagine that the first arrow that came out of nowhere that struck a Neanderthal and killed them was the equivalent of Europeans moving into parts of the world where no one had ever seen a rifle before. And what one does under those circumstances, you can't compete. They have superior weaponry. So what do? You run. You don't try to fight them. And I think part of what happened when we came into Europe was Neanderthals began to move out of their core areas into areas that were more peripheral, that they knew less about, that they were less familiar with. And at the same time, and when they did that, they weren't as effective in terms of their livelihood. And I think that played a role in the disappearance of Neanderthals. We thought there was 10 to maybe 20,000 years overlap between Neanderthals and sapiens. We now know that probably was more in the order of 5,000 years. It was 5,000 years. It was a very rapid replacement. It wasn't a direct kill all the Neanderthals, but I think part of that was involved. Part of that strategy did help bring about their demise. But I think they were swamped by genetically, because we know we exchange genes, and we know that we probably moved them into more peripheral areas. Now, we're moving into a period of time which we call the Upper Paleolithic in Europe. And it's a time when modern humans came in with very sophisticated toolkits, a very sophisticated mind, and certainly modern symbolic language. And they were capable of things like this, painting cave art. And we will see quite a bit of cave art over the next few lectures. So Neanderthals disappeared, except in that 2 to 2.5% Neanderthal genes that we carry in our bodies today, Europeans and Asians, but not Africans. And the first discovery of a modern Homo sapiens in Europe, in terms of the oldest, was found at a site in a little town called Les Aisies. And that's in a stunningly beautiful part of southwest France, especially in the summer and the fall and spring. And it's about 100 miles east of Bordeaux, and there is a fabulous museum there. As you see, there is a Musée National de Préhistoire, the National Museum of Prehistory, and they have wonderful exhibits. They overlook part of the valley in which this little town, Les Aisies, sits. There are other museums like Abri-Pateau, which I believe was excavated by Movius, a fellow from Harvard, and an archaeologist, and that is open as a sort of a live, living excavation. You can look at the layers, you can wander through there, you can see layers, you can see the artifacts that were found there. Gives you a very good idea. Well, what was the first sapiens called. It was called Cro-Magnon. You often hear this term, or Cro-Magnon. And it was found in a little rock overhang, which we called an abri, A-B-R-I, and that's what you see in this large picture at the bottom, this rock overhang. It gave them protection from the elements. They could put skins on the front. And in fact, in this case, they buried people. And there were railroad workers building a railway, and you can still take this little funny railway to Les Aisies, as I have done. And in 1868, they were getting fill when they were putting the tracks in. And they discovered these skeletons. And they were known as Cro-Magnon in French, or Cro-Magnon as we call them. And you can see a little plaque up there. It's only about that big, that commemorates that 1868 discovery. So these were not archaeologists. Well, if you go to this area, which is called the Dordogne, you will also be dazzled by the food. It's not only fantastic archaeology everywhere you look, but also, if you like French food, as I do, you will see spectacular food, drink spectacular food, eat spectacular food, drink wonderful wine. Well, the burial, the Cro-Magnon burial, contained a bunch of grave offerings. Stone tools, very deliberately placed, seashells, which came from at least 100 or more miles away, where they traded. Did Cro-Magnon wander that far and collect them? They were made into beads, for example. There were teeth of animals that were sometimes bored with a little hole to be worn as a pendant. There were plaques of ivory from the mammoths, obviously, with some with engravings on them, about 40,000 years old. And there were a total of 5 male, 1 female, and a child skeleton found at this site. And this is really us, right? This is Homo sapiens. Now, supposedly, as Linnaeus called us, wise man. So one could look at a modern human skull, which we see here, cranium. And you can see it has a very small nasal opening. It has this little depression right here. And you can feel that on your cheek. That's because it doesn't have those big exploded maxillary sinuses like Neanderthals did. And that's given a name, it's called the canina fossa. And reach over here, and in the lower jaw, of course, it has a chin, which Neanderthals didn't have. It now has a very vertical forehead. Remember Neanderthals? They were, I'm going to drop this guy, a receding forehead. Very, very different. And what else do I need? No brow ridges. Some people have brow ridges, as you know. Maybe Uncle Max has very strong brow ridges over his eyes, probably inherited from the common ancestor with Neanderthals, not because we evolved from Neanderthals. And teeth get much smaller in size because all the food processing is being done outside of the mouth, outside of the oral cavity. So they look just like us. That funny thing you see on the front of the forehead is some sort of a bone disease. All right? Very reduced projecting face. That face, very little face out in front, right? Remember Neanderthals? Wow. There's a projecting face, okay? And there are a whole bunch of other features that we don't need to go into, but if you want to know what a Cro-Magnon looked like, go to a museum and look at a modern human skeleton. We're essentially identical. Now, I wanted to just mention a few things about tools. The Stone Age, as you see, Paleolithic, consists of lower Paleolithic, middle Paleolithic, and upper Paleolithic. Upper being more recent. In Europe, in Africa, they're called early, middle, and late. And it comes from an ancient stone technology, from the Greek lithos meaning stone, paleo meaning long time ago. The Acheulean, as you know, goes back to the lower Paleolithic. Earliest was about 1.6 or 1.7 in East Africa. and hung on until a couple 100,000 years ago. Before that, we had the Oldowan, named after Olduvai Gorge. These are more pebble tools. And then beyond that, back to about 3.3, 3.4 million, we had these large blocks of rocks that apparently were used for smashing big things. So the lower Paleolithic is not very sophisticated except for the hand axe. The middle Paleolithic in Europe, which is associated with Neanderthals by and large, or the Mousterian, as we called it, were made, tools made essentially on flakes, as you can see, and this is just to remind you what those look like. The upper Paleolithic that we brought in with us from Africa was a whole different kind of toolkit. It was very diverse. Everything from these harpoons during the Magdalenian times, to long blades, to bone shaft straighteners, perhaps, in the upper part there. This in Europe is from about 45,000 or more up to about 10,000 years ago. And it was a blade technology, like when you pick up your knife, and you know how efficient that is for cutting. The other thing is, there is, in the lower left-hand corner there is what's called a prismatic core. And you can see all of the scars along here where blades have come off. So they would take a piece of rock, they would prepare it, and they would be able to take off long blades as they went around that prismatic core. And this was a real economy of using raw materials to make stone tools. That was the other thing that was interesting. What were the raw materials? Neanderthals sometimes used bone. We're beginning to find out that they used some bone for hide scraping, called lissoirs. But generally, they made their tools on stone. Stone, stone, stone. Bone, antler, and ivory are much more difficult to work. They're more difficult to make tools from, but you can make a great variety of tools. Spear points, chisels, wedges, awls, needles, fishhooks, and so on. And they had very specific hunting tools that Neanderthals didn't have. As I said, probably the bow and arrow, although that is more controversial. But they did have the atlatl, or the spear thrower, or as the French call it, a propulseur. And you see very clearly in this diagram that you take a long spear and another piece of wood, and you hook it in. You can see that just up in the corner right there. And then as you step forward, you throw the spear holding on to this piece of wood, which gives you an extra lever arm, which really sends that spear out quickly, powerfully, and accurately. The Upper Paleolithic tool diversity, the key word in Upper Paleolithic tool technology is innovation. Incredible innovation. These are some of the important time periods in the Upper Paleolithic in terms of cultural traditions: Aurignacian, Gravettian, Solutrean, Magdalenian. We're not going to go into very much detail, but there was an endless variety of end scrapers, burins for boring, perforators for poking through hides and things, back blades, microliths, little tiny things, and hafted things like spear points. And they made them out of bone, antler, and ivory, and stone. And it was quite amazing. And some of them, if you're interested in this, you can look at some of the additional readings to see what typifies these various cultural periods. One should be cautious that some of the very late Neanderthals at sites like Saint-Césaire in northern France were associated with some Upper Paleolithic tools that were supposedly characteristic of us. Maybe there was some cultural transmission going on there. Maybe Neanderthals were bright enough to say, wow, look at those tools. I wonder if we can imitate those or make those or whatever. And maybe they did. And in the Middle East, we have good Homo sapiens, which we'll talk about a little bit later, from places like Kafsa at about 92,000 years ago, that are not making Upper Paleolithic blades. They're making tools that look Middle Paleolithic or Mousterian-like. They were incredible hunters. There's no question. We know that not just from the toolkits, but from the assemblage of bones, the butchered bones that are found in the caves that were in very high numbers that were really a major portion of their diet. They were extraordinary hunters. They lived under natural conditions. They knew about animal behavior. They had a very sophisticated way of bringing these animals down, processing them, cooking them, preparing them, and eating them. And in our next presentation, we're going to move more into looking at how Homo sapiens acted, what its behavior was like, and begin to look at some of their examples of wonderful art.